So we've been talking a lot in this unit about the globalized economy and how it's changed over time and all of that. But in this video, we're going to talk about how all those historical processes of globalization and economic interconnectedness look today. So who's excited about that? Oh, just me. Yeah, I'm okay with that. And I suppose if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. So let's begin with how the globalized economy has fundamentally changed the spatial distribution of work today. The first trend occurred in core countries and is known as deindustrialization, which refers to the disappearance of industrial economic sectors. So get this trend straight in your head. Core countries, if you'll recall, are core precisely because they were the first movers on the industrialization path. But in a weird turn of events, the wealthier and more developed core countries became, the more and more they deindustrialized and focused on tertiary, quaternary, and quinary sectors. So the question then becomes this: if the core countries whose economic sandwich was buttered with industrial production stop manufacturing stuff, then where is all the stuff gonna get made? Well, I'm in the mood to answer that question. So in the decades following World War II, the United States and other core countries' economies were structured according to the principles of Fordism, named after our boy Henry Ford. And Fordism refers to an economy structured around mass consumption and the mass production of standardized manufactured goods. In other words, during this time, much of the world's manufacturing took place in core countries, and that was responsible for a substantial portion of their wealth. But beginning in the 1970s, the cost of domestic manufacturing began to rise significantly, and corporate investment in factory infrastructure no longer seemed to be a good investment. In other words, in core countries, all those folks who worked in manufacturing jobs expected to get paid a living wage, if you can imagine such a thing. And that meant that the bigwigs who owned these factories had to accept lower profits from their goods so they could pay their workers more money. And if you're a factory owner or the CEO of a large manufacturing operation, paying your workers a living wage is kind of a drag because, in case you don't know, those gold-plated toilets and private jets just don't pay for themselves. So that got the higher-ups thinking, I wonder if there's still a way to make stuff but not pay people as much. And as it turns out, they figured out a solution. You see, workers in core countries wouldn't accept such a deal, what with all their labor unions and their demands to be able to afford things like bread and gas. So the result was that many corporate manufacturing giants began investing their money to build factories in peripheral and semi-peripheral countries where the wages and cost of production was very low. And so this movement signaled the end of Fordism in core countries and led to the significant disappearance of industrial sectors from the core economy. In the United States, for example, this had the effect of creating what's known as the Rust Belt, which refers to the various regions that previously thrived economically on manufacturing, but whose factories are now abandoned and rusted out. So as manufacturing jobs declined in core countries, they increased significantly in peripheral and semi-peripheral countries like China and Mexico. And then in core countries, knowledge work in the tertiary sector became the dominant economic activity. And as I mentioned in a previous video, all of this is what we refer to as today's international division of labor. And then there was another significant change in the world economy as a result of this restructuring. But first, let me mention this. If you need help getting a 5 on that national exam, which is coming up quick, fast, and in a hurry, you might want to check out my AP Human Geography Heimler Review Guide, which has everything you need to study as fast as possible for that beast of a test. If that's something you're into, then, check the link in the description. Okay, now the next major effect of this international division of labor is the creation of new manufacturing zones in countries outside the core. And there are 3 of these zones that you're going to need to get cozy with, and I'll name them in a second, but first let me just tell you what's important about them. So because of the shift of manufacturing to countries in the periphery and semi-periphery, these manufacturing zones were created in order to foster the further growth of industry and keep barriers to the global flow of trade as low as possible. So the first kind of zone you need to know is a special economic zone, or SEZ. And this refers to a geographic sector within a country in which business and trade laws are different from the rest of the country in order to attract foreign investment. So for example, China has made significant use of SEZs in order to boost their economic growth since the 1970s. Essentially, the Chinese government declared that certain ports were SEZs, and therefore any trade or manufacturing that occurred in those zones would be subject to lower taxes and reduced custom duties, etc. And that had a way of attracting the heads of multinational organizations in core countries to set up shop there. And as a result of that development, along with many other factors, China today has the second largest economy in the world. And just for poops and giggles, let's tie this back to Unit 2. The creation of these SEZs also led to the mass migration of the rural Chinese population to urban areas to work in these new manufacturing zones, which was the occasion for the largest internal migration the world had ever seen. And then the second kind of manufacturing zone you need to know is called an export processing zone, or EPZ. Now to be clear, this isn't a different species of manufacturing zone from the SEZ, but it's more like a subtype of it. Basically, the EPZ is usually characterized by lower taxes and less strict labor laws, which are established to attract multinational corporations to invest in factories which produce goods for export. So the emphasis here is the construction of manufacturing zones in which corporations can get their goods made without the bother of pesky labor unions and minimum wage laws. No, in EPZs, factory workers in periphery and semi-periphery countries can be paid way less than their counterparts in core countries, and that keeps prices low on mass-produced goods. While that arrangement arrangement works really well to beef up the profits of the corporation, it's not without its controversy, especially in industries like fast fashion. It's like, oh, I can't believe I got this shirt for only $10. But the only reason it's that cheap is because textile workers in Vietnam got paid a pittance of wages to make it. And then the third kind of zone you need to know is also a subtype of SEZ, and it's known as a free trade zone, or FTZ. And these are regions which are designated tax-free and that provide storage and distribution services for goods destined for export. So without FTZs, goods that were shipped from one country to another would be subject to taxes as they cross borders, and that would significantly increase the price of those goods. In that case, your $10 shirt would all of a sudden cost $12, and you know. But since there's a global network of over 5,000 FTZs across the world, goods can be shipped from one region to another without being taxed, and that keeps prices low, which further provides incentives to businesses in core countries to continue outsourcing their manufacturing process to peripheral and semi-peripheral countries. Okay, and finally, let's consider how all these developments have led to significant economic effects in today's world, and there are 4 big effects that you need to know. The first is the rise of Post-Fordism, which refers to the dispersal of the manufacturing process from a single site to many different sites across the globe. So in the post-Fordist economy, companies arrange to have parts of their products manufactured in several different countries and then assembled in another country and then sold in yet another country. And it was the rise of advanced transportation technology for shipping and SEZs which have enabled this kind of dispersed manufacturing to be economically viable. Okay, the second big effect is the increasing presence of multiplier effects, which describes the phenomenon in which creating one job simultaneously creates several jobs. For example, if a car manufacturer decides to open a factory in a particular region, then not only will that factory create jobs for people to build cars, but it will also multiply other jobs as well, including electricians to keep the power flowing to the factory, and janitors to keep it clean, grocery stores, restaurants, barbershops, etc. In other words, all these associated jobs are created in order to support all those people now living in the community. And then the third big effect is the growing prevalence of just-in-time delivery, which refers to the process of manufacturing smaller batches of goods in response to consumer demand. And this is a big deal because instead of mass-producing goods and then paying to store them in warehouses, the global market has created the conditions in which companies can respond to customer demand much quicker and manufacture only what is needed for purchase. So, for example, in a Fordist economy, if you wanted to buy a couch, you just went to the furniture store and you left with a couch, or, maybe it's going to be delivered within a week. And why? Well, because they had a bunch of couches in a warehouse that have already been made. But today you buy a couch and you better be happy sitting on the floor for 6 weeks because much of today's manufacturing is done in response to specific purchases. And so this has reduced companies' need to maintain and pay for large permanent workforces. With just-in-time manufacturing, they can rely more on temporary workers and expand or contract their workforce depending on customer demand, all of which increases their profits and keeps prices low. All that to say, with this development in manufacturing, economies of scale have become much less important for businesses hoping to realize a profit. You see, in the era of post-Fordism, profits are best realized not by mass production, but by producing only enough goods that will be reliably sold on the market. Great for corporate profits, but a little inconvenient for the chump sitting on the floor waiting for his couch to arrive. And then the final effect you need to know is the increase in agglomeration economies, which refer to the spatial concentration of businesses in a similar industry within the same geographic area. And you can see this in countries with well-developed high-tech sectors. Those companies will often cluster in places that have an abundance of highly educated and skilled workers and specialized infrastructure. For example, Silicon Valley, located in the San Francisco Bay Area, is a magnet for high-tech agglomeration economies like Google and Apple. The goods that these companies produce are not manufactured in Silicon Valley. Like Apple doesn't have a factory in Silicon Valley where they're just churning out the latest iPhone. That work is done, as you might have expected by now, in the periphery and semi-periphery. No, in Silicon Valley, Apple employs a bunch of thinky people like designers and engineers and software developers. And so the reason Apple's headquarters is in Silicon Valley is because the region's proximity to major international airports and world-class universities that supply skilled workers for their labor pool. And because agglomeration economies also create multiplier effects, we refer to them as growth poles, or you might hear them called technopoles. And therefore, governments wanting to stimulate their economies have incentives to attract those growth pole industries, which will theoretically cascade into more and more jobs and thus increase economic opportunities in their region. Okay, click here to review other topics in Unit 7, and click here to grab my Heimler review guide, which has everything you need to study as fast as possible for that national exam in May. I appreciate you coming around, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.